Okay, let's unpack this. We have some really thought-provoking source material here. It digs into one of those truly fundamental, almost mind-bending questions.
Right.
If your thinking speed somehow increased dramatically, let's say by 100 times, how would that actually change your experience of time?
Mm.
Would a normal calendar year suddenly feel like you've lived through 100 years?
Mm.
Or would it flip? Would 100 external years feel like they just zipped past you in one quick, subjective year?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Which way does it actually go?
Exactly. That's the core hypothetical we're diving into today. And this deep dive, it's built specifically for you, the listener, taking the sources you provided and really working through them. We want to pull out the most important nuggets.
The key insights, yeah, and maybe some surprising conclusions, too.
And the philosophical core of these ideas, really.
Well, the material approaches this from a few distinct angles, which is actually great because it gives us a clear structure to follow. We look at what happens when, just your internal brain speed shifts. Then what happens when only the world around you accelerates its rate of change. And then finally, what happens when both of those things speed up together? It lays out a really fascinating framework for understanding perception.
Absolutely. By looking at these different scenarios, the sources seem to reveal something pretty profound about, well, our perception of time, obviously, but also about what it means to be human.
And maybe even the nature of existence itself, some deep stuff.
For sure. So let's jump right into what the material highlights first, because to even start tackling this, the sources immediately point out a crucial distinction we have to keep in mind.
Right. Objective time versus subjective time.
Right.
You really need to separate those two.
Okay, so objective time, that's the easy one.
Pretty much, yeah. It's
Yeah.
the kind we measure with clocks, calendars. It's the external physical reality. A year is a year defined by, the Earth going around the sun or atomic vibrations. It's constant outside of us.
Got it. But subjective time, that's the slippery one.
That's the personal one, yeah. It's how you feel time passing internally. It's why sometimes an hour feels like 10 minutes when you're totally engrossed in something.
Or why 5 minutes waiting for, I don't know, the microwave feels like an eternity.
Exactly. And the real insight pulled from the sources here is that this subjective feeling, it isn't random. It's heavily influenced by what they term processing density.
Processing density. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Think of it as how much information your brain is actively taking in and dealing with per unit of objective time. Per second, per minute, whatever.
That connection makes so much sense when you think about the examples they use. Like, why do moments of intense danger, say a near miss in traffic, feel like they unfold in slow motion?
Right. Because in that brief objective moment, maybe just a second or two, your brain is processing an absolutely massive amount of sensory data and potential responses. It's working incredibly rapidly.
But the density of processing shoots way up.
Exactly. And that super high density makes that short objective period feel stretched out subjectively.
And the classic example everyone talks about, this childhood summers feeling endless versus adult years just flashing by.
Same principle, just on a different scale. As a child, everything is new, right? Your brain is constantly learning, adapting, building models of the world. That's extremely high processing density over long periods.
Okay.
As we age, life often becomes more routine. Fewer novel stimuli, maybe lower processing density day to day.
So the subjective experience of time compresses.
That's the idea. Years feel shorter because less new stuff, less dense information is packed into them from your brain's perspective. So subjective time can dramatically warp based purely on how much mental stuff you're working through.
Okay, that foundational split between objective and subjective time driven by this processing density idea that gives us the lens we need. So let's dive into the first major hypothetical scenario the sources lay out. What happens if only your brain's internal processing speed accelerates? Let's stick with that 100 times faster figure they use. So neurons firing faster, thought, memory access, all boosted. But the physical world outside keeps ticking along at its normal pace.
The immediate outcome described in the material is pretty vivid. The external world would appear to you to be moving incredibly slowly, like almost painfully slow motion.
The Matrix bullet time kind of slow, people moving like they're wading through molasses.
Precisely that kind of feeling, yeah. And the reason ties directly back to that processing density. Your internal clock, your subjective experience engine, is running 100 times faster than the external world's clock.
So you can fit, 100 seconds worth of internal thought perception into just one objective second.
That's the math, yeah. Your subjective time has accelerated dramatically relative to everything outside you.
Wow. Okay, so a normal say, minute-long conversation for someone else would subjectively feel like, what, an hour and 40 minutes? Almost 2 hours.
That's the implication. A 2-hour deep dive for you while they just said a sentence or two?
You'd have time to analyze their posture, their microexpressions, recall every relevant past interaction, formulate multiple nuanced responses, all while they're just talking.
That's the picture painted in the sources,
That's-
yes. And ordinary exchange becomes this incredibly extended dialogue from your perspective. And yeah, other people's physical movements would look incredibly sluggish, almost frozen in time between your rapid bursts of perception.
Which brings us back to the core question for this scenario then. If only your brain accelerates 100 times, what does one external objective year feel like?
The conclusion drawn from this scenario in the sources is pretty clear. That external year would feel subjectively like 100 years of your own lived experience.
100 years lived.
Yeah, because you've processed that much more information, had that many more thoughts, lived through that many more subjective moments relative to the objective passage of time. This is where that 1 year feels like 100 years lived idea comes from. Your subjective world has just massively expanded. On the surface, it sounds like some kind of superpower, right? Gating all this time. But the sources, they're quick to pump the brakes and point out some pretty significant downsides, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. It's framed less as a blessing and more as an extreme form of, isolation.
Isolation, how so?
Well, think about it. Communication would be nearly impossible with normal speed humans. Imagine waiting for someone to finish a sentence that, to you, feels like it's taking minutes or even longer.
Okay, yeah. That would be maddening.
And waiting for anything would become torturous. They use the example of a 10-second elevator ride. Subjectively for you, that's over 16 minutes of just standing there waiting.
Ugh, the sheer boredom, stuck in a static, normal speed world. That would be immense.
It's potentially agonizing, yeah.
Yeah.
The material suggests adapting to exist in that state, so radically out of sync with the fundamental rhythm of the world and everyone else, it would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
Okay, so that's one extreme. Let's flip it completely now. What if your brain speed stays normal, totally baseline human, but the external world's rate of change accelerates dramatically?
Right, and this is where the sources bring in that AI 2027 hypothetical example.
AI 2027.
Okay. The idea here is that 100 years worth of technological progress, societal evolution, cultural shifts, all that external stuff happens in just one objective calendar year.
1 year. Wow.
And the distinction is key here. The physical clock, objective time, isn't speeding up. A second is still a second. What's accelerating is the density of events and changes happening in the environment around you.
So new technologies popping up constantly, laws changing overnight, social norms evolving week by week, jobs transforming, knowledge becoming outdated almost instantly.
All at a breakneck pace, yeah.
Yeah.
100 times faster than we experience now.
So, okay, a normal speed human brain trying to navigate a world changing that fast. What's the subjective feeling described there?
Overwhelming, that's the main word. The feeling of being utterly left behind, unable to keep up. That the world is fundamentally changing too fast to process, let alone adapt to.
Because your normal processing speed just can't handle the sheer fire hose of 100 years of external change compressed into one single year.
Exactly. Your internal processing density relative to the external information flow is now vastly mismatched, but in the opposite direction from the first scenario. Your capacity to process is constant, but the rate of things to process has just exploded.
Right. So, connecting this back to the question for this scenario, what does one external year feel like when the world accelerates 100 times, but you stay the same?
The subjective outcome described here is that it feels like 100 years have passed by externally, leaving you feeling like you're standing still relative to this torrent of change.
Rob.
It's that feeling of being completely outpaced, just watching a world that's moved on a century in just 12 months. This is the 1 year feels like 100 years gone by direction. You feel bypassed.
That sounds, well, incredibly anxiety-inducing. What were some of the specific impacts noted in the material?
Oh yeah, significant fear and anxiety from the sheer inability to adapt. The sources mention concepts like digital aging.
Digital aging.
Yeah, where individuals feel functionally ancient because their knowledge and skills become obsolete within years or maybe even months in this scenario. Institutions, laws, social norms, they'd all struggle or just completely fail to keep up, leading to chaos. It's a scenario of profound dislocation.
But they do introduce a fascinating potential lifeline in this scenario, using AI. Even if our brains don't speed up, AI could potentially help bridge that gap.
That was a really interesting point they raised. AI could act as a kind of subjective accelerator for humans, even if our biology doesn't change.
How would that work?
Well, by digesting and summarizing the immense amount of rapidly changing information, filtering the signal from the noise, maybe aiding in rapid decision making, essentially translating the accelerated external reality into a format a normal human mind can grasp.
So the AI processes the 100x speed world and gives us the highlights.
Kind of, yeah. It wouldn't speed you up biologically, but it could make the accelerated world feel subjectively less overwhelming. It might allow you to process a higher density of external events than you could manage alone, reducing that feeling of being left behind.
Interesting. Okay, so we've looked at your brain accelerating world looks slow. 1 year feels like 100 lived.
Right.
And then the world accelerating you feel left behind. 1 year feels like 100 gone by. Yeah. Now for the scenario where things get really wild, the one the sources explore, where both your brain capacity and the external world's rate of change accelerate dramatically. Let's say both by 100 times simultaneously.
This is where the nature of the experience shifts fundamentally, according to the material. If the external world accelerates 100x and your cognitive processing speed and capacity also increase 100x to match,
What's the subjective outcome then? Does time feel completely alien, off the rails?
well, what's fascinating, maybe even counterintuitive, is that the sources argue your subjective perception of time would actually return to feeling normal.
Normal? Seriously? How can that feel normal if everything's going 100 times faster?
Because your increased internal processing speed now precisely matches the increased rate at which new information, events, and changes are happening externally, the ratio is balanced again.
Ah, the ratio between internal processing and external input.
Exactly. It's back in sync. So your subjective internal clock resynchronizes with the accelerated objective reality, even though that reality is moving incredibly fast by our current standards. One external year would subjectively feel like 1 year again.
Okay, wait. It feels like a normal year passing, but
Okay.
the reality packed into that year is anything but normal.
Precisely. That is the crucial point they make. While the feeling of time passage might be familiar, a year feels like a year. The density of experience, learning, thought, events, maybe even social interactions packed into that single objective year is 100 times greater than what we experience now.
So it's less like living one normal year and more like living multiple lifetimes worth of subjective experience compressed into that single year of objective time.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. The sheer volume of lived life per objective unit of time is enormous.
That scale is,
Yeah.
almost impossible to really grasp. The sources suggest this fundamentally changes what the being experiencing it is, right?
They absolutely do. They argue pretty strongly that a being capable of processing information, learning, and adapting to a world changing at that accelerated pace is no longer what we currently understand as human.
Not human.
Yeah.
So
What then? Something qualitatively different. Perhaps post-human, or as one perspective in the sources puts it, something approaching a technological divinity.
Wow.
I mean, think about what that level of processing means. The sources mention the ability to absorb and understand dozens of complex books in a single second of objective time.
a second, okay. That's hitting seriously deep philosophical territory, particularly around identity.
Sure.
If your knowledge, your experiences, your fundamental understanding of reality are all accumulating at that density, and your personality is changing so rapidly over one objective year, are you still the same person in any meaningful sense we understand?
The material doesn't shy away from this at all. It suggests this scenario inherently involves a form of loss of personal identity, or at least a profound personality transformation.
So the continuous sort of slower evolving sense of self that we baseline humans have that would likely be broken or just dramatically redefined.
That seems to be the implication. Broken, redefined, maybe irrelevant. It's hard to say. The sheer density and speed of subjective change would just be too much for our current model of identity.
And what about society? Ethics?
Right.
Even big concepts like death, how would they look?
Completely transformed, you'd have to assume. Society would need mechanisms for real-time adaptation. Laws that can evolve instantly, maybe. Social structures that are incredibly fluid.
And learning wouldn't be a multi-year process anymore.
No, it might be near instantaneous assimilation of information, and views on mortality could shift dramatically. Maybe the emphasis moves away from biological lifespan towards the density and quality of cognitive experience within whatever time is available.
So thinking about this outcome, this third scenario, Is it framed in the sources as a kind of evolution, like moving to a higher state of being?
Mm.
Or is it more of a discontinuity, a complete break from humanity?
That's a great question. The sources seem to present it as potentially both, or maybe it's just two sides of the same coin viewed from different perspectives.
How so?
Well, from the internal perspective of the being living it could feel like an incredible evolutionary leap, right? A vast expansion of capability and understanding.
Okay.
But from the perspective of a baseline human, looking at that being and its transformed experience, it probably represents a fundamental break, a discontinuity from everything we currently recognize as human existence. It's something else entirely.
Wow. Okay. We've definitely covered a lot of ground here, traversing these potential realities based on how our sources frame them. Bringing this all back to you, the listener. What's the fundamental revelation we can take away from this deep dive into these different scenarios?
I think the core idea that really emerges, for me anyway, is how incredibly flexible and, well, subjective our experience of time really is. It's not just this fixed march forward dictated by clocks and calendars.
It's more dynamic.
It's this dynamic interplay, between our internal capacity to process information, you could say, how much life we can subjectively cram into each moment, and the rate at which the external world presents us with new information and change.
And the sources really highlight how dramatically altering either one of those factors, the internal speed or the external speed, can completely warp our perception. It can lead to feelings ranging from being overwhelmed and left behind,
To living what feels like lifetimes in a single year.
or, in that most extreme case,
Yeah.
potentially transforming our very sense of self, who we even are. So this isn't just some fun sci-fi thought experiment, is it? Thinking about these hypotheticals using this material, it genuinely helps us understand the mechanics of our own time perception right now.
Yeah, especially in a world that certainly feels like it's accelerating all the time.
Agreed. It gives us a framework for understanding that feeling maybe of things moving too fast sometimes, or those moments where time seems to slow down for us personally.
Makes those everyday experiences seem a bit deeper.
Exactly. Which leaves us with something really compelling to ponder as you go about your day. Given that our technology is already accelerating the rate of change in the world around us,
It definitely is.
constantly presenting us with new information, new experiences, and maybe subtly changing how we process information through, constant connectivity, rapid-fire inputs online.
Yeah, that constant stream.
What does that mean for our subjective experience of time and maybe even our sense of who we are right here, right now? Not in 100 years, but today.
That's a heavy thought to end on.
Something to chew on, definitely, as you navigate your own processing density in this increasingly dynamic reality we're all in.